We are determined to see the fall of Zionism and imperialism, and we are determined to win.
We will weather all your attempts to cut us down, and just as the sun rises, we too will continue to rise until Palestine is free.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode of the popular Cradle podcast. This is Muhammad. I'm here joined with Yara, and we've decided to give Ree a break for this episode. Hey, Yara, how are you doing?
Hey, Muhammad. I'm doing okay. Excited to get into the episode.
Since our last episode, we've seen the continued blockade of the Gaza Strip, the mass starvation of Palestinian people, the complete denial of fuel, food, and all aid into the Gaza Strip. And we've also seen these asinine responses by the U.S. and Israel, including the creation of these so-called humanitarian distribution zones. These are plans essentially meant to force the people of Gaza into a concentrated area, essentially concentration camps, in order to effectuate the plan of ethnic cleansing. And at the same time, we've seen mass slaughter, massacres take place at these aid distribution points. In conjunction with this starvation plan, we've seen people who were otherwise cheerleading the Israeli genocide now begin to speak out against it, but not in the name of anti-Zionism or in support of Palestinian liberation, but rather as an attempt to redeem Zionism and the Zionist project. We've seen people like Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister of the state of Israel, who's made his rounds in Western media trying to provide what he describes as an alternative image of Zionism and to redeem Zionism in contrast with that of the Netanyahu government.
Yeah, and like Piers Morgan, who spent the last year and a half really cheerleading and providing media cover for this genocide, suddenly changing his tune, or even Matthew Miller, the former press secretary for this U.S. State Department under Biden. After a year of him standing on that podium, smirking, making excuses for Israel's actions, and now suddenly trying to distance himself from the position of the U.S. government. But I think, like you said, there's this really key thing that's taking place, and you see it clearly in Piers Morgan's discourse, which is trying to pin this on the Netanyahu government. And I think that's like a perfect example of what we should be expecting in terms of like this attempt to redeem Zionism.
But this mainstream shift that we've seen is not genuinely reflective of the actual substantive change that has taken place on the grassroots level, on the popular level, of people who identify the problem of this genocide not with the Netanyahu government or Ben Gvir or Smotrich, but with Zionism itself as a project of ethnic cleansing, of dispossession and displacement of Palestinians, and of mass slaughter of Palestinians ultimately in its most recent iteration that we've seen over the last year and a half. And so in this episode, we're going to explore the tactics that we've seen utilized over the last year and a half, and the discourse that has accompanied it is actually constitutive of Zionism, is at its core from its inception, and that, in fact, this genocide is a continuation of Zionism as a project, not a departure from Zionism.
And so let's begin with what Zionism claimed itself to be from its early thinkers, which is really directly as a colonial movement. There's this huge gap between how Zionism originally spoke of itself in the early 1900s, openly bragging about its colonial ambitions during a period when colonialism was largely accepted. It was constitutive of the broader kind of European world, where European nations were colonizing much of the global South. And then there would be this shift in the 60s and 70s during a period when anti-colonialism was at a peak, where the people of the global South were challenging colonization everywhere. And in this moment, Zionist propaganda started to distance itself from its colonial kind of origins by trying to claim itself as a movement for Jewish self-determination. And this shift of narrative that is reflective of the broader history between colonialism and anti-colonialism, shows us really concretely Zionism's propaganda pillar and how central Zionism's propaganda pillar is in adapting Zionism and articulating it based on what allows for it to pursue its agenda. And so we often think about Zionism as this military project, right? People make the statement that Israel is a military with a state, not a state with a military. And while that's not untrue, of course, the military component of Zionism is critical for its functioning alongside its economic apparatus as well. But there's also this propaganda pillar that's really, really critical to the Zionist project, and that allows for Zionism to reframe itself, right, in the early days as a colonial movement, and then later on in the 1960s and 70s as an indigenous movement, right, in the language of Zionism. And the ability of Zionists to shape propaganda around Zionism is a critical part of shielding the Zionist project and protecting it from its inevitable demise. And that's why this current moment is so important, because we're seeing right now a huge movement of people across the world that is committed to anti-Zionism and fighting against not just Netanyahu's government, but the Zionist project as a project, like you said, Muhammad. And in this moment, it's really critical for us to be able to historicize Zionism for what it truly is in order to make sure that Zionism isn't allowed to rebuild this propaganda pillar and to shield itself again.
Right, Yara, you mentioned early Zionist thinkers, and I think it's important to begin with explaining what questions or contradictions they sought to resolve or answer through Zionism. And so those were primarily three things: anti-Semitism, or the Jewish question, the role that Zionism can play for imperialism or Western colonialism, and three, the presence of Palestinians or an indigenous population in the land of Palestine.
Okay, so let's start with the Jewish question, because the period in which Zionism emerges was a period where anti-Semitism was a key issue in Europe. And in particular, Jewish populations within Europe were facing high levels of persecution. And it was actually anti-Semites, Christian Zionists, European imperialists, who wanted or believed in a solution to what they saw as Europe's Jewish problem, which was basically to try to force the Jewish people out of Europe. And this was a deeply anti-Semitic kind of position and ideology that was rejected by Jewish people within Europe who were, largely anti-Zionist. Zionism didn't formally exist at the time, but they didn't believe that they needed to leave Europe in order to solve anti-Semitism. Some of them believed in the need to assimilate into European society. Some of them were organized in more radical formations, in socialist, anarchist, anti-imperialist groups, because they were facing high persecution at the time. And so Zionism actually kind of emerges as this reactionary solution to anti-Semitism, because basically what it's saying to the Jews of Europe is, you can never fight anti-Semitism within Europe. You should never seek to fight against colonialism or imperialism or capitalism or racism. And instead, what you should do is align with Europe and accept that anti-Semitism is this transhistoric constant feature of the world. And so then the solution becomes for Jewish people to leave Europe and to colonize Palestine. And even at the time, there wasn't agreement that it would be Palestine. Like, there were debates about what country would be colonized in order to create the Jewish state. And Zionism then also works to de-radicalize more radical iterations of what the Jews of Europe should be doing in terms of fighting against capitalism and racism. And instead, it forms this kind of unity through the Zionist project between European anti-Semites and racists and colonialists and Jewish Zionists, who sought to basically convince Jews within Europe that the solution to anti-Semitism is not a fight against European colonialism and racism, but actually this alignment with European empires to colonize Palestine.
And that's why anti-Semitism becomes this eternal justification for Zionism. It's why we see within Zionist propaganda the centrality of anti-Semitism, because ultimately, in the absence of this trans-historical, metaphysical force that knows no borders and is always around the corner to assault Jewish people, Israel would have no justification to exist. And it's not only that it should exist, but that it should always exist as a garrison, militarized state that is justified in dominating an entire people endlessly in the name of combating anti-Semitism. But beyond just answering anti-Semitism, the main point around being useful for imperialism was the critical factor that determined the fate of Zionism, because ultimately it's not enough to have aspirations for a state, especially when you don't have the concentration of people, resources, military power, political and diplomatic power in order to fulfill those aspirations. You need the world superpowers to facilitate it for you, especially where we're talking about a territory that they don't even control yet, right? Palestine, at the time that Zionist thinkers are formulating the idea of Zionism, is under the control of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And so you're turning to essentially these Western colonial powers and saying, well, we can be of service to you. We can be an outpost for you. And this logic of outpost for the West has continuity from the very beginning of Zionism till this day. And we see this in the sort of way Netanyahu mobilizes the role that Israel plays for the West, that if not for Israel, the West would be facing this horde of barbaric, uncivilized terrorists, that Israel is what stands in the way between Iran and Hezbollah and various other forces in the region and terrorism in their home countries. Israel historically during the Cold War is what stood in the way between Arab nationalism and communism and socialism, not just in the region, but all over the globe, and the US, the liberal, democratic, capitalist West. Israel is that first line of defense. That's how it's been conceived of. And the exact formulation of that role has changed over time to meet the moments. In the same way that, Yara, you described it, changed to meet whatever political or social milieu. And we know this also just as organizers or activists. Israel became, or Zionism became, an intersectional movement, or Zionism was a land back movement. Whatever it needs or whatever formulation it can use to justify its existence. It's a chameleon, ultimately, because it's about justifying Zionism as a project than it is actually describing what it means materially and what it's done to Palestinians and what role it ultimately plays for the West.
Yeah, and on this point of historical continuity, Mohammed, back in, I want to say like the early 1900s, Theodor Herzl, who's seen as this father of Zionism, basically meets with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and he's trying to garner England's support for the Zionist project, for the establishment of a Zionist state in Palestine. And he says to him, quote, "At one stroke, England will get 10 million secret but loyal subjects active in all walks of life all over the world. At a signal, all of them will place themselves at the service of the magnanimous nation that brings long-desired help. England will get 10 million agents for her greatness and her influence. And the effect of this kind of thing usually spreads from the political to the economic." I think Herzl's rhetoric from the early 1900s shows like even that earliest formation of this idea of the greatest ally, right? Israel is from its earliest days, from before Israel even existed, Zionists were articulating to imperialists that the colonization of Palestine, that their support, their partnership, this kind of organic unity, to reference the language that we heard from the imperialism episode, is part and parcel of its self-conception. And so just to recap quickly, that first contradiction that we talked about, the Jewish question, right? That was Zionism trying to resolve how to convince, in particular, Jews from Europe, European Jews, to take up the project of colonizing Palestine. And then the second task at hand for Zionists was how to convince European nations to support both materially and militarily and so on the colonization of Palestine. But all of that culminates in really what is like the primary contradiction, which is, okay, you've convinced European Jews that they all need to move to Palestine, to colonize Palestine, and you've convinced European nations to support this project. But then what do you do about the Palestinians who live in Palestine, right? Because it's not a land without a people. It's in fact a land with a people, the Palestinian people.
And this primary contradiction that you laid out, Yara, I think is how we should understand this genocide we just witnessed. That's ultimately what it's about. That's ultimately what it's meant to resolve. And it's not simply that this population was present, this indigenous people were present on the land, but actually that these people were aware of and resistant to Zionism as a project. And in fact, I think this is why it's important to turn back to Zionists, because they too were aware of the awareness of the Arabs about Zionism. And so I want to pull a quote from The Iron Wall by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who is considered the grandfather of revisionist Zionism, the founding ideology of the Likud party, the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the party that's dominated Israeli politics for at least multiple decades and really came into prominence in the early 70s. And so Jabotinsky in The Iron Wall is in conversation with other Zionist thinkers. And The Iron Wall is actually a proposal on how to deal with the Arab population of Palestine, the Palestinians. In this quote, here he's actually reprimanding what he calls the peacemongers, people who are trying to essentially buy out or persuade the Palestinians to leave the land through some form of manipulation or another. He says, every native population, civilized or not, regards its lands as its national home, of which it is the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, but even new partners or collaborators. This is equally true of the Arabs. Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine in return for cultural and economic advantages. I repudiate this conception of the Palestinian Arabs. Culturally, they are 500 years behind us. They have neither our endurance nor our determination, but they are as good psychologists as we are, and their minds have been sharpened like ours by century of fine-spun logomachy. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with the honeyed words to make them palatable. But they know what we want as well as we know what they do not want. They feel at least the same instinctive, jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and their Sioux for their rolling prairies. And so Jabotinsky here, first of all, identifies the Palestinians as this indigenous population. And second, positions Zionism and the project of Zionism as a project of colonialism. And in fact, what's made clear in his proposal in this document ultimately is that the posture that they must take isn't through persuasion or diplomacy, but through brute force. He recognizes the contradiction between the presence of Palestinians and the Palestinian national project and the project of Zionism as one that must be solved through victory, even if it necessitates ethnic cleansing and ultimately will necessitate military domination and genocide.
And I want to take us back into this idea of the Iron Wall for a second, because I think there's something that Jabotinsky was trying to point at, right? Like he was trying to make an argument, which is basically, in order for Zionism to survive, it needs to basically erect this iron wall. And I think he uses this like a language of basically like that a strong power in Palestine that is not amenable to any Arab pressure. And so at the heart of the Zionist project is this attempt to construct a wall that could never, ever be threatened by Palestinian resistance, could never be threatened by Arab nations. And we know that that's not true. Like, we know that the wall has been breached many times, and we know that it was breached, for example, most recently at a military level, let's say on October 7th. And that resulted in the need for Zionism to basically, for the state of Israel to basically take such an extreme reaction in attempt to reconstruct that wall, right? To basically,
or at least the illusion of that wall.
Exactly, yeah. In order to, not only to the Arabs, right? Because on the one hand, it's trying to etch in the Palestinian psyche, like, that you can never do this. So it's trying to kind of produce a genocide that is so vicious that Palestinians never consider resistance as a project again. But also materially, it's trying to reconstruct its military capabilities to rebuild its image and its ability to exist as a nation state, because it I mean, they use a language.
It's really one of its reasons for being, right? Its utility to the West, like where we started this conversation, really.
Yeah. And I mean, they use a language of this being an existential war, right? So they see this as an existential war because Israel is constantly in a place of trying to insist on its right to exist. I mean, I think that's where even we constantly hear this language of like, well, do you think Israel has a right to exist? You're constantly trying to force anyone who fights for Palestinian liberation, anyone who is a public figure that talks about Palestine, the immediate question that you get is, well, do you believe in Israel's right to exist? What other nation is asked this question? People are asked this question constantly because Israel is trying to construct this iron wall that basically says this is a permanent feature. This is exactly the reality that we're confronted with today, right? There's this antagonistic contradiction between Zionism as a political project and Palestinian self-determination and national liberation. I mean, Jabotinsky is acknowledging that himself, and many Palestinians scholars and theorists and revolutionaries have made the same claim, like that an ideology predicated on the eradication of Palestine as a nation and the Palestinian people and the colonization of Palestinian land is inherently at odds with Palestinian self-determination. And I think we see the reality of this antagonistic contradiction constantly, like through this particular genocide, of course, but even dating back to the Nakba, right? Like the Nakba of 1948 represented exactly that. Palestinians refused to accept the Zionist project. And so what did the Zionist project do? It committed massacres and it expelled over 750,000 Palestinians from the land. And the Palestinians who remained, who offered a possibility of a threat to the Zionist project, were rounded up and put in prisons. And the Palestinians who were expelled and who were in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and these neighboring nations and set up camps, refugee camps, to basically say, we refuse to abandon the Palestinian project and we want to return. They were met with also instances of massacres. I mean, we saw clearly through, for example, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, where Zionism again presented itself in the most unmasked genocidal way because Palestinians in the camps were organizing politically, culturally, militarily, and presented a threat by even just by the existence of the camp, by basically saying, we're not giving up our right of return. And so Zionism is at odds with the possibility of Palestinian resistance, Palestinian liberation, the possibility of Palestinian return, even going all the way to the diaspora. Like, why do Zionist organizations in the diaspora, why are they constantly attacking Palestinians? Why does a website like Canary Mission exist? It's because Palestinian political organization that threatens Zionism on any level, right? And in the diaspora, it could be economic through BDS, right? Or ideological through cultural programming and political programming, right? That presents itself as a threat to Zionism. And so Zionist institutions, sort of beyond just the state of Israel and its military and economic apparatus, are constantly trying to erase that Palestinian contradiction, working with the US government or other governments to basically destroy Palestinian organizing as a way to also resolve that contradiction. Like, that contradiction is antagonistic everywhere it resides.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ara. And I think over time, there have been these moments, these like heightened moments where we see sort of Zionism's bare face, right? The Nakba being sort of the historic example, but throughout its history, and especially in the contemporary moment, what we know is that the common thread, the common logic of ethnic cleansing, right? The fact that Israel to exist as it does requires a Jewish demographic majority, requires the subjugation of the Palestinian national movement, wherever it might be, because it serves as a threat to this project of ethnic cleansing. Inherent to that is, to the extent that that project faces resistance, opposition, is a capacity for genocide, ultimately. Because when you see these various heightened moments, ultimately what they are opportunities for Zionism to go to its fullest extent, right? And so to the extent that there are these moments like the Oslo Accords, where there's this idea of peace for land, like that's the sort of narrative. The Israelis are exchanging land that doesn't belong to them for peace. That is simply about creating the time until there is an opportunity to actually execute ethnic cleansing and, when needed, genocide. And that's the moment we're in. And so at any point in time that we, like, going back to the central point of our conversation today, is that this is not about the Netanyahu government. This is not about the current composition of the war cabinet. This is not about Israel in its current iteration, or about revisionist Zionism or religious Zionism or right-wing Zionism. This is about what Zionism has been historically and throughout the years, the experience of Palestinians. An experience of dispossession and displacement, and ultimately genocide. We cannot allow that truth to ever be masked by those who seek to redeem Zionism or to portray Zionism in a different light, because liberal Zionism is simply Zionism pregnant with genocide, not yet born.
Yeah, exactly, Muhammad. That's a tough statement to follow, but I think what you're naming here in terms of the fact that embedded within Zionism constantly is this threshold for genocide, right? Like this genocide waiting to happen. That idea is so clear to the world right now in ways that it never has been before. The mask is completely off. You know, historically, Zionist propaganda really relied on this narrative of what the Palestinians are and then what Zionism is. Israel as this sort of reflection of European values, right? Palestinians as terrorists, or this Orientalist image of the Palestinians. And in the last 20 months, although, you know, I think we could argue that this unraveling has been ongoing in various particular moments, right? Like in, let's say, 2021, right? Through what was taking place in Sheikh Jarrah, when people started to kind of see the Palestinian story. But I think really in the last 20 months, there's been a shattering of this dichotomy of this narrative, where we've seen, I mean, first of all, like we've seen millions of people moved into action, right? They're seeing things on their TV. They're joining protests for the first time. They're being brought into a mass movement that's basically teaching them in a lot of ways through organizing about Palestine, about Palestinian history, about the Nakba, about, you know, the story of the Palestinian people, the struggle of the Palestinian people. And then I think at a really basic level, people are starting to watch these stories come out of Gaza, specifically like stories of people who've been martyred, and are seeing so clearly what's taking place on the ground. And I'm thinking here, for example, of the story of Hind Rajab, right? Which we've talked about on the podcast before, where people were able to watch her story and it moved them into action. And it made it impossible to kind of continue to hold these preconceived notions of what the Palestinian struggle is and what it isn't. people named like actions after her, buildings after her, or an organization after her, right? An organization specifically tasked with exposing Zionist war crimes, right? Because that is what Hind Rajab, that is what her martyrdom also represented in so many ways. Like, how could anybody hear the story of Hind and not be moved into action, not see Zionism for what it is?
Yeah, Yara, that's a really great point, because I think that these stories, these individualized stories of someone like a 6-year-old Hind Rajab, are difficult for Zionists to be able to continue a project of dehumanization around, because you can't help but see the 6-year-old in your own child, for example, or in your sibling, or in a relative. And not just Hind Rajab, but so many other stories, I think, have made it to where people have formed genuine emotional bonds with Palestinians in Gaza who are telling their stories, whether it's Rifat al-Arir or the photojournalist, for example, Fatma Hassoune, who was killed along with 10 family members after we watched her record conversation with representatives of the Cannes Film Festival, informing her that her documentary had been selected, only for her to be assassinated the next day. And so you can't dehumanize someone like that, or any of the other countless Palestinians who've told their stories throughout this moment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just that people are becoming exposed to like individual Palestinian stories, but it's that they're also being exposed to the question of who are the Palestinian people and what are they fighting for? What are the political claims that the Palestinian people have been making? What are the different moments in Palestinian history that have brought us to the particular moment that we're in? And what is it that Palestinians are fighting against? All of these questions are surfacing for so many people around the world through their engagement, whether it be with their own TV or social media or within the broader movement. People are seeing clearly what is it that Palestinians are struggling for and what is it that they're up against.
Yes, the last question, Yara, I think, like what Palestinians are up against, has also been answered by Zionists themselves, by Israeli leaders, by the reactions that Zionists have to the humanization of Palestinians, for example. On the one hand, what we have is these IDF soldiers mass murdering Palestinians and filming themselves in the act of dehumanization, whether they're donning the clothing of Palestinian women, whether they're doing gender reveals by blowing up Palestinian homes or schools or universities, whatever it might be. And we're also hearing from Israeli leaders described in their own words, not the spins that we hear in English when Israeli spokespeople are sent to the Western media to try to justify the actions of the Israelis, but from the actual political leadership itself, from the war cabinet, from people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who brag about the starvation campaign, who brag about making Gaza effectively unlivable for Palestinians so that they're able to colonize it. You know, the translation feature on X or Twitter is probably the worst thing that could have happened to Zionism, because we could hear directly or see directly from the speech of Israeli media or Israeli political leadership. And I think beyond that, we've also seen sort of the reaction they have to, for example, someone like Miss Rachel, someone who's described as raising millions of children. You know, we're talking about parents who see their relationship to their own child in proximity to this woman. And the idea that she would bring a Palestinian child who has lost her leg because of a bombing by the Israelis is something that is quote unquote anti-Semitic or Hamas propaganda, demonstrates or puts into question rather all of the dehumanization and all of the Zionist propaganda that has been weaponized up until that moment. So if this is anti-Semitic and you've described everything else as anti-Semitic, or this is Hamas propaganda and you've described everything else as Hamas propaganda, then clearly you're selling some bullshit. Because on a visceral level, everyone knows that that child could be their child, and that Miss Rachel would show affection or empathy or love towards this child is being spun by Zionist propaganda as something abhorrent, means there's a problem with Zionism, not with Miss Rachel.
Yeah, and I think this visceral reaction, like from Zionists, is a reflection of Zionism trying to use propaganda to save itself, which is something that we know Zionists are going to do. Like, you have a propaganda machine, like propaganda is so integral to Zionism, to what it is, to how it's able to stand on its legs, right? How is Zionism able to engage in massacres and displacement for decades while positioning itself in the West as the most moral army in the Middle East? Like, that is done through propaganda, through a disconnect between what Zionism is doing in Palestine, in the region, versus how Zionism speaks about itself. And in the last 20 months, we've seen just how clearly Zionism cares about its image, not enough to stop its genocide, because we know that that's so integral to its existence, but enough to invest millions of dollars in trying to protect its image, in trying to dehumanize Palestinians and to shift public opinion back towards supporting Israel. And it does this through so many ways. I mean, Mohammed, you alluded to some of these points already, but for example, the attempt to use the language of human shields as a way to justify what it's doing, right? And so you've got these numbers that are piling up in terms of martyrs in Gaza. And so, of course, they do try to actually question the numbers. You watch these interviews with Zionist pundits, most of whom are being paid actually like through Israel's kind of like Hasbara or propaganda approach and program, where they'll actually say, oh, those numbers are Hamas propaganda, right? If an interviewer says a particular number, they'll say, oh, that's Hamas propaganda. You're using statistics that are from Hamas or whatever. But even when they're forced to accept a variation of numbers of martyrs, well, they respond and say, well, actually, it's a situation of human shields. It's Hamas's fault. Hamas is using people as human shields. I mean, that's how they're trying to explain or justify the tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, or the hospitals that they're bombing. They'll say, well, there's Hamas military commands underneath them. And so they are trying to basically shift the blame by saying that the deaths, the killings, the massacres are not actually because of Israel. They're not actually because of Zionism, because they're realizing that people are saying, well, this is wrong. And so they're saying, well, actually, that's not because of us. It's because Hamas is using these people as human shields. What does that try to do to the average kind of psyche of a person who's listening? It's to say, well, actually, it's not that Israel is so depraved that it's killing children and bombing hospitals. It's that Palestinians are so terroristic that they use their own population as human shields. And maybe this historically might have worked, and historically it did used to work. And it used to kind of place people to question, oh, well, probably then this wouldn't be happening if Hamas didn't exist. Like, that's what it tries, this sort of argument, this sort of propaganda tries to do. But in this current moment, it's not working anymore. People are rejecting this premise entirely, not just because they're witnessing horrors on their TVs and on their social medias, but also because they're being exposed to the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian struggle, which is helping them historicize and understand exactly what this language is designed to do. It's helping them understand what is the fight of the Palestinian people and why are the people of Gaza engaged in the struggle that they're engaged in.
Even this abstract question that's typically leveraged to attack anyone who dares question or criticize Israel is the question of, does Israel have a right to exist? Which, if you think hard about it, is an absurd question. But I think this attempt to continue to reframe the conversation or the debate in an abstract way is intentional. It's meant to separate the reality that we see, the facts on the ground, the hard data, everything we know about what's happened, whether it's the settlements, whether it's the military occupation, whether it's the genocide itself, all of these things from the conversation, to remove that from the debate. And so the question of does Israel have a right to exist is more clear to everyone what that actually means. Does Israel, this entity that is pregnant with genocide, that is maintaining a system of apartheid, that's militarily occupying Palestinians for decades, ethnically cleansing them from their land, from the river to the sea, that's expanding into the surrounding Arab lands of Lebanon and Syria, that threatens global forces for progress everywhere. Does this genocidal entity have a right to exist the way that it does? That's the way this question has been transformed from an abstract question that's meant to be a got you, that's meant to put people on the defensive, into a question that people easily and readily answer no. And that is the transformation that we've seen because of the things that we just discussed, because people have seen Palestinians for who they are and what their claims are, and because people have seen Zionism and Israel for what it is. Even these attempts by Israel propagandists to sow doubt into what we're seeing on a daily basis, what we're witnessing with our own eyes, what we're seeing live streamed on a daily basis. All of these things just reflect the fact that Israel and its propaganda machine is working into overdrive to try to pull the mask back on what Zionism is. And it's really an impossible feat. And this is why we're even seeing amongst mainstream pundits, going back to the conversation we actually started with, attempting to carve out this tiny slither of space to rescue Zionist propaganda. And I think on a grassroots level, on a popular level, we've reached the point of no return.
And one of the ways that they are going to try to put this mask back on, or have already been, for decades really using to try to put the mask back on, is through the allegation of anti-Semitism. This idea that being supportive of Palestine, organizing for Palestine, asking any kind of critical question about Israel and its right to exist, about its genocidal actions, is anti-Semitic. And this kind of stems to the way in which Zionism as an ideology has tied itself to anti-Semitism. And ultimately, this ties directly to Zionism's effort, concretely, historically, to basically tie this project to the Jewish people, to form an ideology whereby Zionism and Judaism are tied together, despite the fact that they historically had not been. And so really, I think at the core of this is a responsibility of the Palestine movement to reject this premise. And we've already seen a rejection of this premise. I mean, so much of the world is rejecting the idea that being against Israel, standing against Israel's genocide, or even being anti-Zionist and rejecting Israel's right to exist as a genocidal entity that occupies Palestinian land, which, by the way, is the only way that Israel has ever existed, is anti-Semitic. Like, people refuse to accept this term. And I think what's really important here is that this isn't just an ideological thing. Like, it's not just that standing up for Palestine will get you accused of anti-Semitism. But what we need to be prepared for as a movement, and what's already been happening, is the way in which this is actually being leveraged through political and legal institutions, particularly in the West. And this relates also to another point that is integral to Zionism, which is Zionism's relationship to imperialism. So, why is it that Donald Trump, who is this anti-woke president and kind of this champion against wokeness on all of these different levels, why is it that he's going ahead and taking up seriously this quote unquote question of anti-Semitism on student campuses? Why are people being arrested and deported, threatened of deportations over their anti-Zionist activism under this kind of project of combating anti-Semitism, right? The way in which these two projects, the project of Zionism and the project of US imperialism, are coalescing in order to defend Israel and use the language of anti-Semitism to do so, is something that we need to be vigilant against as a movement in order to make sure that the Zionist project is not able to obfuscate what the struggle is actually about. And so if we're armed with the knowledge of what Zionism is from its foundations until this current moment, which is a genocidal project built off of the eradication, the displacement, the exploitation of Palestinians, built off of the relationship between imperialism. And we also know that Israel will do everything in its power to try to rebrand itself, that propaganda as a central pillar in its ability to sustain the Zionist project and continue to colonize Palestinian land. And we know that Israel will spend millions of dollars in order to do this.
Yeah, in fact, it's allocated $150 million, more than 20 times the amount it's previously allocated annually to, quote unquote, win hearts and minds abroad.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So it's not an abstract thing that it's like concrete and millions, like you say, behind it.
And so if we are aware that this is what Israel is going to try to do in order to reconstruct its iron wall after this genocide, then we know clearly what our task is, which is not only to expose Israel's ongoing genocide, but is to also prevent it from being able to rebuild its image, to distance the Zionist project from Netanyahu's government, for example.
Right, Yara. And that's why it's the responsibility of the movement to really prioritize and take seriously our responsibility to counter this propaganda. And I think this is going to happen on a number of levels. First, it's important that we deepen our knowledge of Palestinian history, political claims, Zionist history, and the current composition and character of the Israeli government, and the various ways that anti-Semitism will be weaponized, the way that claims around terrorism will be weaponized. But beyond that, it's important for us to materially isolate Zionism. And I think the prime example of this is an arms embargo, a two-way arms embargo. That is the central task, because ultimately those weapons and military cargo is what will continue to facilitate genocide and colonization, but also on a cultural and social level, right?
Right.
These whitewashing campaigns that we'll see when Israel sends out its various cultural projects, right? Whether it's in sporting or film or the arts, whatever it might be, this is where we see the centrality of the BDS movement in countering this. And I think it's important to understand that this is exactly what was needed in the context of apartheid South Africa, is this isolation. And we need to make sure, whereas in the past, people came up with all of these different excuses as to why it is not prudent to boycott Israeli academia, or why it's not prudent to boycott the Israeli cultural sphere. I think it's more clear than ever now that the entirety of Israeli society on a cultural, social, academic, industrial level was mobilized to wage this genocide. And any engagement or any allowance by us, the movement, or us in the diaspora, for this rebranding to happen, to whitewash this role, would be a huge setback for us, because in a world system where imperialism dominates or prevents actual justice from taking place, it is on us on a popular and grassroots level, on an institutional level, to actually secure justice for the Palestinian people. And in fact, it would be a disservice to this moment, and it would be a disservice to our martyrs, the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that have been martyred or wounded, the thousands of prisoners languishing in Israeli prisons, the wholesale destruction of Palestinian society in Gaza, if we allowed any form of redemption on the part of Zionism. It would continue to provide political and cultural cover for the ongoing colonization of Palestine, and it will lay the groundwork for a future genocide of the Palestinian people.
And on that note, we're going to close out today's episode of the Popular Cradle podcast with clarity on what Zionism is and what it has always been as a genocidal project, and clarity about what the task at hand for people across the world that support Palestine is, in order to isolate Zionism, in order to confront it wherever it resides, in order to end the genocide and end Zionism completely.
Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.